Let's talk taxes. Nobody loves them, but they keep our hospitals running, our roads paved, and our schools open. And with the Canadian federal election just around the corner, politicians are making big promises to cut taxes. But here's the real question. Are these tax cuts actually a win for you, or there's a catch? The Liberals say they will drop the first tax bracket to 14%, while Conservatives want to slash it even further to 12.75%. Sounds great, right? But where does the money come from? And what does it mean for Canada's growing 1.17 trillion debt? Today, I'm breaking it all down. Who is promising what, how it affects your wallet, and what this election could mean for Canada's future. Let's get right into it. The first thing is that it is important to understand the federal tax system in general. And Canada has a progressive tax system, meaning that the more you earn, the more tax that you pay. And for the current tax brackets for 2025, based on Canada revenue data, it shows that there's a 15% income tax at federal level for those who make up to 53,375,000. And I will do an example and explain. It is important to note that if you're on the lower tax bracket, there is the basic personal amount of 16,128 that is exempt from tax. Now, if you are making between 53,375 and 114,750, you are taxed 20.5%. You see, the tax increases to 26% if you are making between 114,750 to 165,430. It goes to 29% for income that is 165,430 to 253,414,000. Now, 33% for anything, any income, in this case, that is above 253,414. Now, let me do a quick calculation. Let's say you earn $53,375, which is the lowest tax bracket, right? And then what happens is that in the Liberals' proposal of 14%, we would say 53,375 minus the 16,128, right? And we'll get 37,000, we'll get 37,247. And then we would say 14% of 37,247. And then for the conservative case of 12.5%, we'll say 12.75% of 37,247, and we'll get $4,748.99 in terms of the tax that would be paid by someone in that income bracket. And the difference is now between what you would pay under the liberal tax plan of 14% on the lower tax bracket and 12.75%, the conservative proposal would be 214.58 minus 4,748.99, and would get $465.59 per year. And this would be the savings per the year. Let's say the conservatives win, you would save $465.59. So you would have this money back in your pocket. Now, it is important, I think, to also kind of understand in simple terms Canada's debt and budget. Can we really afford this? Just like individuals, countries have a budget, right? That means they have the revenue, government revenue, and then they also have fiscal expenditures. And according to Trading Economics and Department of Finance Canada, Canadian government debt is around 1.17 trillion Canadian dollars, and the budget deficit, right, is minus 1.4% of GDP. And the last time I checked, the Canadian GDP is just above 2.1 trillion Canadian dollars. And the fiscal expenditure for the latest cycle was 38.2 billion Canadian dollars. So at least in this case, there was a surplus. If you say 44.3 billion minus 38.2 billion. So that kind of like helps to narrow the fiscal deficit, right? Now, what does this mean for you and me? Lowering taxes, of course, it means less tax revenue, right, for the government. But to offset this, either the government will have to cut spending on healthcare, infrastructure, or other government programs, and or increase debt, which means that for the future generations will pay this off. But there's also another angle, right? The government can unleash some programs, massive investments that can potentially generate a higher return. For example, what the conservatives are proposing, that we unleash our natural resource base, we exploit them, right, to an extent that we can increase our government revenue at federal level and even at provincial and territorial level. And that could help to boost the government revenue, right, whilst also offsetting or reducing the expenses, because if expenses increase more, still with the increasing revenue, the net effect would be zero. Now, there are also other proposals, and I listened to Mark Carney, who is the leader for the Liberal Party. He was talking of increasing productivity, and also has already removed carbon tax, and which is something that I find to be very interesting. Now, there is the political landscape and the major election contenders. For those who don't know, in Canada here, we have a federal election to elect our representatives at federal level. And how it works is that whichever party wins the majority will then actually have the prime minister. In this case, we have Prime Minister Carney, and we had former Prime Minister Trudeau. And there are going to be two debates, the one in French and the other one in English. And these debates are scheduled for 16th and 17th of April in Montreal. And the election will be on the 28th of April. Now, the recent polls here in Canada, according to 338 Canada, as of March 25, when I last checked, the political landscape has shifted. Before Prime Minister Trudeau left the political scene, it did look like the Conservatives were going to have a whitewash. They were going to win, right, resoundingly. But now the political fortunes, it seems like they've been shifting, and I'm going to provide my thoughts on that. The Liberals, led by Mark Carney, are up 41% as of March 25 in terms of the polling, the survey that was done. And the Conservatives, led by Pierre Poilievre, are trailing at 37%, and that's a 4% margin. And these polls and surveys, they have some margin of error, by the way, but they do indicate, out of those people who are asked, let's say if you are to vote today, who are you going to vote? So that is what at least that symbol represents. And you have actually the population, right, which will vote. So if that is a true representative of the population's wills and what they are thinking, and in politics, things can change quickly. So far, this is what we have. NDP, Jagmeet Singh, they are trailing at 10%, and the Bloc Québécois, led by Yves Francois Blanchard, they are at 7%, and the Greens, co-led by Elizabeth May, a seasoned politician actually, and Jonathan Pedonald, they are at 4%. Now, what I think has caused the shift and the Liberals to actually pivot and actually, at least from this survey and the sentiment that I'm seeing, is that the Trump tariffs, the tariffs that are supposed to be scheduled to take effect on 2 April, they've really united Canadians, because there's also this talk that Canada could become the 51st state, according to what President Trump has been saying, which I find to be very disrespectful of the Canadian sovereignty. Is that, that has really united Canadians to say Canada would never become the 51st state. And after the Liberal leader, now the Prime Minister, Carney, right now is now the Liberal leader, because after he proclaimed the election, now he's the Liberal leader. Now we don't have, like, we kind of like it's a caretaker role. But when he was still, soon after he won, he went to France, he went to the UK to assert Canada's sovereignty and economic ties, which I found to be very interesting. But here is the catch: the tariffs that President Trump is proposing, tariffs by their very nature, it's an economic tool. You are looking at taxes, you're looking at, there are quite a number of them. Sorry. But the issue is that Canada exports about, let's say, 75% of our products here, including our oil from Alberta at a cheaper price than the world market price. So what this means is that if we are having problem with our neighbor, our biggest export destination, there's bound to be a problem, because if you look at the intensity of the sectors that solely export to the US, you're looking at the automotive, the computers, and all these other sectors, right? If you are to model it out, it means if these tariffs are affected, it means some companies will have a hard time. Let's say if they can't sell as much, so some people might possibly lose jobs. Let's say, according to Dr. Trevor Tombe's estimation, about 600,000 people might possibly lose jobs. And you are looking at 600,000 people, right? These are not just numbers, it's statistics. These are just people and the families, and this might potentially cause the Canadian GDP to even contract further. And that might also possibly cause inflation. So that's why you see the Bank of Canada actually reduced interest rate to kind of like preempt that. And that also can take a hit on the Canadian dollar versus the US dollar or other currencies that are gaining strength. But there is, I think at the end of the day, Canada has a lot of resources. So by removing the inter-province and territorial trade barriers, we can potentially unleash, open up other markets. And also, while it takes time, Canada can also open up other markets. You are looking at Europe, the EU, and also other parts of the world. And there's this interesting debate that can Canada technically be part of the EU? And that's something that is interesting now that the US is, in this case, kind of like exhibiting economic aggression. And of course, the US has every reason to do what they think can grow their economy. But the issue is that because these two economies are co-integrated, they were like Siamese twins, right? So this is causing challenges. And I know there was one former Canadian Prime Minister who said, I think I forget his name right off my bed, but he said that Canada and the US is like you sleep next to an elephant, right? You can hear it breathe, you can hear it make any sound. And it's intimidating because if you are looking at the Canadian economy versus the US economy, I think our economy is 1/10 of the US economy. So what this means is the US is more diversified, it has, other export destinations. And if Canada, let's say they were to do dollar for dollar tariffs, I think at the end of the day, economically, the effects would be much dire here in Canada because our GDP would likely shrink, other things constant, right? And would have the Bank of Canada would have to lower interest rates and come up with other, methods to prop up the economy. But however, politically, I think there might be some costs, but I think it's important to understand that when tariffs are levied, What it means is that if you put 25% of the tariffs, they are usually passed on to the consumer. So if we leave 25%, of course, we equalize the tariffs that way. But then ultimately, Canadian consumer will pay more. And usually, firms, they are likely to actually, pass those costs to consumers. And you also have China. At this opportune time, our economy is very vulnerable. In this case, our GDP has not been growing that much. Now, Canada actually slapped Canada with tariffs, which was in retaliation with the tariffs that Canada actually implemented. I think that was in October last year. So this is a whole political landscape that is unfolding. But the thing is, at the end of the day, the political landscape here in Canada, at least at federal level, is interesting. I think after the election, we'll see which part wins. But in this case, each party is offering different proposals, and we'll see more as the days go by. And what I can tell is that from what at least the Liberals are offering, they are offering moderate tax cuts of 14%, focus on balanced fiscal policy, which I think is a very good thing. But the Conservatives also, they are offering even bigger tax cuts, 12.75% versus 14% by the Liberals, right? And also to reduce spending, which can potentially affect other people if it reduces spending of other things. But I think at the end of the day, it would be very interesting to see the fully costed budgets and everything that they are proposing, all these political parties. But when I look at the NDP and the bloc, NDP has been losing most of their support. Now it has been dropping. I think also because now people are now kind of like, as this survey that I shared with you, kind of like favoring the liberals because they have actually come back to the center, right? And what this means is that, the conservative in this case, they are in a tight spot. Now, the Greens, I respect them, and also the bloc, but they are more like regional political. They are popular in certain regions, right? If you look at the bloc in Quebec and the Greens, they are also popular in some parts here in BC, but in terms of their national growth and the possibility of them actually clinging or becoming the majority government, at least from the statistics, nothing is impossible in politics, but I think there's a remote chance, at least from the statistics that we see, and also the sentiment and the surveys and the polls that have been taking place. Now, what does this mean for you, right? Lower taxes, of course, it means more money in your pocket, but how will Canada cover the lost revenue? But I think if there are ways of, these political parties actually ramping up the government covers revenue, like expanding the intertrade, like I said, and also it takes time exploring other export destinations and also increasing, leveraging our resources at even other world market prices. But these things, they take time. You need to invest in infrastructure. Let's say the automobile um, companies that are actually based, let's say the factories that are in Ontario. And Doug Ford recently won another election, and he has been very vocal against, these tariffs, and even proposed to put a surcharge on electricity that goes to the US, right? Canada and the US, historically they've been at least there's been this rocky times, but the good thing is that at the end of the day, some politicians, at least they come and go. But at the end of the day, what I see is that all these policies will have an impact on the Canadian economy. And at least you see the prices reflecting that in the shops. In Canada, people are championing buy local. If you go to the shops, buy Canadian products, and are also canceling some other vacations and also exploring Canada even more. There are a lot of other places to see within Canada. It's massive country and from coast to coast to coast. So those are some of the things, but I think it will be important to have a stronger mandate. Whoever wins in this upcoming federal election will be very interesting, but it's important for me. I'm interested to see how all these proposed policies and ultimately the policies that whoever will win will implement on the economy and the debt. For me, that is a major concern. We have to pay off our debt. And also these things will have an effect on the exchange rate. For some people who send money overseas, if the Canadian dollar loses value, it means you have to pay more, right? If you are sending in US dollars. Or if you are a trader or if you are in the invested in the stock market, in the short term, I think probably the Toronto Stock Exchange, some businesses that have a lot of debt might actually find challenges. But on the flip side, some wonderful businesses might actually be spooked by what is happening in the financial markets and then sell at a discount. So that might be a wonderful opportunity. I'm looking at several companies to potentially invest here in Canada. Now, the key takeaway is that also it's not just about taxes. It's also about how the government funds or propose will fund ultimately whoever wins will fund the essential services here in Canada. But what do you think about the taxes? Should taxes be lower or should the government focus on reducing debt? Comments below, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay tuned for updates after the leaders debate that is slated for April 16 and 17 in Montreal. Mercy, thank you for tuning in, and I hope to talk to you guys soon. Bye bye for now.